there are some additional articulatory gestures which need to be explained. And in this topic, we are going to discuss tap, flap, and trill, which are approximants and central approximants, basically, right? And these sounds are distinguishable, although at times it's very challenging to distinguish among them. But as the students of phonetics and phonology, we need to be able to distinguish among them, and we also need to be, describing them and explaining them, classifying them. So that's the discussion point for this topic: tap, flap, and trill. Right? These are central approximants, and by central approximants, we mean that the air passage is allowed to pass through the center of the oral cavity. Right? Then, just for comparison, le is lateral approximant, and these three, tap, flap, and trill, they are central approximant, right? Tap and flap are almost similar. There is one point which we need to be, discussing as a difference between tap and flap, right? But these are very, very similar, tap and flap. And that similarity is that in the case of a tap, there is one single contact between your tip of the tongue and your, this alveolar ridge, right? Like r. But in the case of tap, there is one single contact, right? And then this single contact is very rapid, right? It's a very rapid contact, and it's only once. So that's tap or flap. I will distinguish between these two later, but right now, just to keep in mind that tap and flap are very, very similar, right? Then we have got trill sound, which is r. The basic difference between a tap and a trill is that the tap is one single contact, but in the case of trill, this is, the tip of the tongue which is set in motion, right? That's the muscular activity when the tip of the tongue is set in motion, and there is continuous vibration. Like, for example, I can tell you this example by, just pronouncing continuously this r sound, like r. You just see this tip of the tongue, it is in continuous vibration, r. So this is the longer one. The contact is continuous, right? It is touching, right? And then this trill sound is pronounced. It's striking continuously, right? And that sound, r, is very common, you see. And the stricture of intermittent closure, right? That's the intermittent closure which is created, and stricture is created. And then the result is the trill sound. I can give you now examples for these sounds. Tap, like in the American pronunciation of this sound, pere, right? So although this is t sound, but it is pronounced like r, but that r, when there is only one single contact between your tip of the tongue and your alveolar ridge, right? So this is pere, right? So this pere is the tap sound, and another distinguishable feature of tap is that your tongue is moving up and down, right? So this is up and down movement. Your touch, you just touch the alveolar ridge through the tip of your tongue, and the result is tap sound, right? And the top of the tip of the tongue is used, right? And now if you just take an example of flap, and this is now the time to distinguish between these two sounds. Flap is one very common sound, which is typical flap. In Indo-Aryan languages, like the common Pakistani regional languages, we have l sound, right? Lalka, l sound, all right? So this l is basically a very good example of a flap, right? And that flap is when the movement of your tongue is from the back towards the front. You see, you just curl back your tongue for the articulation of this sound, l. If you just get prepared for this sound, but you do not pronounce it, you just get prepared for the pronunciation, Okay, so when you just set in motion your tongue, then your tongue is curling behind. Okay, this curling behind, and the movement is from the back side towards the front side, right? Like in the case of tap, it was the up and down movement. But in the case of flap, it is from the back towards the front, and then it is from the underside of the tongue, and it's curling behind. Okay, so that's the difference between tap and flap. And I can give you an example of trill also. In words like rai or ro, the first sound is trill, and it's comparatively easy to be pronounced. But there is a typical Scottish r sound, r. They typically pronounce it r. And the definition of this trill sound is that the articulator is set in motion. The articulator, which is tongue, it is set in motion, and it is striking continuously and by the current of the air, and the result sound is trill, right? I can further give you the examples of flap sounds. Since it is a curve, the tongue is curling from the back towards the front, and the sound is l. And there are, sounds typically called retroflex. Retroflex flap. The l sound is basically a retroflex when there is retroflexion. And retroflexion is a distinguishable feature of Indo-Aryan languages. Like 3 examples which I can give you here are l, right? This is l, okay, l sound. And if you just see that this is r, but then there is this curling, signal, curling sign, which shows that the sound is retroflex. And then this is d, right? This is a retroflex d, and again here is curling sign, and this is n. So these sounds are very common in Indo-Aryan languages. And the example which I can give you here is that for retroflex sound, you see, you just let me draw this, right? You curve your tongue, right, against the alveolar ridge, right? And the resulting sound is retroflex, okay? This is your tongue, right? And for retroflex sound, it just go back, right? And then you push it towards the front of the tongue, and the result sound is l, right? So this curling of tongue is an identical feature of retroflexion, and this retroflexion is a typical, realization of flap sound.